Hello plant friends, welcome back. My name is Jimmy. I'm a doctor and tropical plant hobbyist in LA, and this channel is about plants. In this episode, we'll be talking about soil for philodendrons. I did make a video about soil for Monstera, and I'll put it above and I'll link it in the description below. So next to my elbow, I have a Philodendron pastazanium. This guy has been a really good grower. So this is the soil composition that this guy is in, and I would say that this is probably a little bit more typical of what I normally use. A little bit more soil, a good amount of perlite, some bark, and you have some bigger chunks of bark in there. If there was one thing I want to say about soil for philodendron as opposed to or compared to soil for Monstera, is that philodendron are a lot less nitpicky, right? I think that they are able to thrive in a wider range of soil compositions, and also they tolerate wetness much more readily. When you're planting philodendrons, you can use a higher proportion of potting mix. Potting mix helps retain moisture, and when you're doing monsteras really don't like moisture retention because they're a lot more susceptible to root rot. So for monsteras, I recommend about 30% or less potting mix as part of your soil composition. With philodendrons, I feel like you can probably go, even up to 50%, and they will still do okay. This is my variegated horsehead philodendron, or the bipennifolium. It is acting a little bit funky, but definitely it's not the soil's fault. So you can see for this one, it's a lot more perlite, not very little bark. And this was because while I was making this soil, I really didn't have any orchid bark on hand. So it's not really that necessarily for me to have, equal parts this or that. I think that I just focus on the principle of having it very light and airy and chunky as best as I can using the materials that I have on hand. This guy has been thriving really well. And let me see, yeah, there are some pieces of bark in there, but again, very little. When we're talking about Monstera are on a very extreme spectrum where they want it really airy, really well draining, because they're really prone to root rot. I feel like when you're talking about philodendrons, you're sort of like going more towards the midline, where even though they do like and want airy and well draining soil, they're not as nitpicky. So you sort of have a wider window or range of error when you're composing your soil composition. I probably wouldn't recommend more than 50% potting soil mix starting out. Again, remember that this is all about just, baseline components or baseline compositions. You really have to tailor these to suit your needs, your environment, and your watering habits. Right? So let's say that we start with, let's say 50% potting soil mix and then 50% other stuff, right? With other stuff meaning bark, perlite, or orchid mix. Let's just say you start out with that. In a month or in a couple weeks, you see that your soil is just getting super dry every single time you water it, whatever your watering frequency is. And your leaf tips are starting to get brown, right? Well, at this point, you either can water more often, or you can alter the composition. You can add a little bit more potting soil mix to help keep the water there longer. So I would do that if your leaf tips were on the brown side or on the dry side. However, I would really make sure that the plant dictates that and not you dictating it for the plant. Let the plant tell you what it wants. I feel that philodendrons are especially good with telling you when they're dry. Monsteras as well. I think that you should let them tell you when they're too dry, as opposed to you saying that they're too dry and then overwatering and then risking root rot. This is my Philodendron gigas.
And here's the soil mixture for this one. I would say this is pretty good. I think I used a good amount of soil in this one just because I know that philodendrons tend to tolerate more moisture. So this one has a good amount of soil. You can see there's some small pieces of bark, plenty of perlite. If you're enjoying the content, please don't forget to like and subscribe and click that bell button if you want notifications on future videos.
So one point I want to make is that when your plant is not growing to your expectations, that's not a sign that you need to water more or that the soil needs to be wetter. Okay? I feel like a lot of people, when they say that, my plant is growing too slowly, they add more water in hopes that it'll spur the plant to grow faster, or that they think that the slow growth is secondary to not having enough water. If your philodendron needs water, it will tell you by having brown tips on the leaves, or the leaves will crinkle, or the leaves will just look dry. Or I think sometimes it even tilts a little bit or wilts when it's dry for some of them. So that's how they tell you. That's how they tell you they need water, right? Growth is a separate thing. I think that there should be, someone has to really cut this connection between growth and needing more water or less water.
This one is the soil for my varicosum. So all these plants were watered about the same time, about a couple days ago. If we're looking at the soil for this one, I use a lot more soil on this one, and I don't think it's conscious. I think it was just kind of some absent-mindedness on my part. See, this one has a lot more potting soil than what I would normally use nowadays. If I were to repot this, I would add quite a bit more perlite and then some orchid bark if I have on hand. But it's been thriving in these conditions, even though it's much wetter than some of the other mixes that I do. So some plants tolerate more moisture and are more resistant to root rot than others. I would not recommend using this mix for any Monstera because I feel like even a short time in a mix this wet, you'd be risking root rot.
So I normally only have 4 bags of soil components at home. I have 1 bag of potting mix, just regular, cheap, simple potting mix. I have a bag of orchid mix, cheap, simple orchid mix. I normally have a bag of perlite, simple, cheap perlite, and sometimes I also have a bag of smaller pieces of bark, also simple and cheap, small pieces of bark. I like cheap, go cheap, save money for college or other plants. One thing that should really stand out is that all my pots really look a little different. Right? The soil compositions are not identical at all, right? There are some that have a lot more perlite, some that have a lot more bark. Some, unfortunately, like my varicosum, had a lot more potting soil than I would like at this point. But it's been doing well so far, so I'm just going to leave it. The compositions are different, again, not because of a specific plant or the specific species, but mostly just because the feasibility and practicality of when I made the composition. When I had more bark, I put more bark in. When I had more perlite, I put more perlite in. Feasibility, practicality, convenience. These are the principles that I really, really focus on when I'm planting. How else are you going to be caring for all these plants plus managing the other aspects of your life and still stay sane? You really kind of have to keep this plant hobby as feasible, convenient, and practical as possible. So all my plants tap water, 3 at most 4 components in their soil composition. I sort of just mix it in and feel around and be very flexible with that. They're all in terracotta pots and they all get probably about medium light. And I water them every 7 to 10 days, depending on how I feel, how busy I am, and they're doing okay. So the last thing I want to say is that I don't have anything against complicated mixtures, but I do feel that people should also realize that soil compositions can be very simple and still do well for some people. So if you try a simple mixture and it doesn't work well for you, or you want to try something more complex, definitely do that. But again, I want people to know what the more simplified end of the spectrum is, so that you guys can make an informed choice about what works best for you. Until next time, happy planting.